The execution at Tyburn turned into a nightmare when the hangman cut the rope too soon. William Carter fell to the ground fully conscious, only to wake up on the slab as the executioner's knife began ripping into his stomach to remove his insides. In a final act of defiance, he shoved the butcher's hand away and screamed, "I am not dead yet," forcing the panicked executioner to abandon the ritual and bring the axe down in a frantic killing blow to sever his head, desperate to silence the man and finish the botched job. Carter wasn't killed just for being a Catholic. He was butchered because he triggered Queen Elizabeth's deepest insecurity. He used his printing press to distribute books branding her a bastard, tearing open the old wound of her mother's scandalous execution. The Queen needed a death, this painful and public, to prove that attacking her legitimacy was a sin far deadlier than ordinary treason. Queen Elizabeth I sat on a precarious throne, viewed by Catholic Europe not as a rightful monarch, but as illegitimate. The Pope's 1570 excommunication order absolved English Catholics of their allegiance, effectively turning them into potential enemies of the state. This declaration transformed a religious dispute into a geopolitical crisis, plunging the English government into a state of constant, paranoid anxiety regarding its own people. Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spy master, recognized that this conflict was actually an information war. He viewed the printing press as a dangerous weapon, capable of spreading dissent and undoing royal propaganda faster than any army could move. To maintain control, the state treated books as legitimate threats, knowing that a single smuggled pamphlet had the power to radicalize the population against the crown. In response, the authorities launched a ruthless crackdown, empowering agents to smash presses and hunt down forbidden texts. They raided homes and imprisoned printers to enforce total censorship over the written word. It was in this atmosphere of surveillance that William Carter, a simple tradesman and father, emerged as a central figure in the underground resistance. William Carter was born in London in 1548, just 1 year after the death of Henry VIII. He was a child of the Reformation's chaos, born into a city that was rapidly changing its religious skin. He was not born into the crushing poverty of the London slums, nor was he a scion of the nobility. He was the son of a draper, a merchant who dealt in cloth. In the hierarchy of Tudor London, this placed him firmly in the middling sort. His family was respectable, hard-working, and commercially minded. The draper's trade is tactile. It involves feeling the weave of wool, judging the quality of velvet, measuring yards of linen. It is a trade of substance. But young William had a mind for something more abstract. He was drawn not to the texture of fabric, but to the architecture of words. In 1563, at the age of 15, a decision was made that would define his destiny. On Candlemas Day, February 2nd, a feast day that celebrates the presentation of Christ in the temple, William was apprenticed. He left his father's shop to learn the mystery of printing. The term mystery in this context comes from the French métier, meaning trade or craft, but for printing, the older meaning feels appropriate. Printing was a kind of magic. It was the art of taking a thought and multiplying it 1,000 times. It was the industrialization of memory. Crucially, Carter did not apprentice with just any printer. He was taken under the wing of John Cawood. Cawood was a titan. He was not a back-alley pamphleteer. He was the establishment. He had served as the royal printer to Queen Mary I, and his skill was so undeniable that when the Protestant Elizabeth took the throne, Cawood retained his position as the Queen's printer. For 10 years, from 1563 to 1573, Carter worked in the heart of the beast. He lived in Cawood's house, likely near St. Paul's Cathedral, the epicenter of the book trade. Under Cawood's tutelage, Carter learned the trade from the ground up. He learned to stand before the type cases, his hand moving like a bird, picking out the lead letters, sorts, and placing them into the composing stick. He learned to read backwards and upside down. He learned to lock the pages of type into the iron chase, creating the heavy forme that would go onto the press. He learned to mix the ink, a sticky, viscous black sludge made of varnish and lampblack. He learned to beat the ink onto the type using leather balls stuffed with wool. He learned the rhythm of the press itself, the pull of the bar that lowered the platen and pressed the paper onto the inked type. It was back-breaking, repetitive work that required immense physical strength and precision. But he learned more than mechanics. He learned the business. He saw how books were licensed. He saw how the stationer's company operated. He saw how the government used print to enforce its will. He was printing the Queen's own proclamations, the very laws that would later be used to kill him. He was an insider. He knew the system's strengths, and more importantly, he knew its blind spots. During these formative years, Carter also absorbed the religious complexities of his master. Cawood was a survivor, a man who navigated the shifting tides of faith with caution. Carter, however, began to develop a conviction that was far less flexible. As he set the type for Protestant sermons, a dissonance grew in his soul. He was a Catholic in a city that was criminalizing his faith. When his apprenticeship ended in 1573, William Carter stood at a crossroads. He was a master printer. He had the skills to open a shop on Paternoster Row. He could have printed almanacs, cookbooks, legal treatises, or safe conformist sermons. He could have married, raised a family in comfort, and died a wealthy man. Instead, he went underground. He took a job that was, on the surface, a step down for a master craftsman. He became a secretary, but his employer was no ordinary man. Carter went to work for Nicholas Harpsfield. Harpsfield was a prisoner of conscience. A brilliant scholar, he had been the Archdeacon of Canterbury under Queen Mary. When Elizabeth took power, Harpsfield refused to swear the oath of supremacy. He would not accept a woman, or indeed any secular monarch, as the head of the church. For this refusal, he was locked up in Fleet Prison. Elizabethan prisons were strange, porous institutions. They were not the hermetically sealed panopticons of the modern era. If you had money and friends, imprisonment was a relative term. You could rent a private room, you could have your own furniture, you could receive visitors, you could write. The Fleet became Carter's new university. He acted as Harpsfield's amanuensis. As the old scholar's health failed, Carter became his hands. He sat in the dim light of the prison cell, transcribing Harpsfield's controversial theological manuscripts. This period was Carter's radicalization. He wasn't just dealing with the mechanics of print anymore. He was absorbing the ideology of the resistance. He was transcribing arguments that dismantled the legitimacy of the Elizabethan Church. He was meeting the network of underground priests and sympathizers who visited Harpsfield. He was being vetted, tested, and trusted. When Harpsfield died in 1575, Carter was no longer just a printer. He was a soldier in the culture war. He had inherited a mission. He knew that the Catholic community in England was starving for intellectual and spiritual sustenance. They needed prayer books. They needed apologetics. They needed words to help them survive the persecution. And William Carter knew exactly how to give it to them. Around 1576, Carter took a wife. While historical records often leave the women of this era nameless, her role was pivotal. She must have shared his convictions and his courage. Marrying William Carter was not a path to domestic bliss. It was a commitment to a life of high-stakes criminality. Together they set up a household at Tower Hill. The location was audacious, right in the shadow of the Tower of London, the symbol of royal power and the state's primary prison. Here, in the labyrinth of London's housing, Carter established his secret press. This was a logistical nightmare. A printing press is not a laptop. It is a massive piece of oak and iron. It weighs hundreds of pounds. It vibrates the floorboards. The biggest problem was the sound. The thump of the platen hitting the type, the creak of the screw, the rattle of the carriage. These were distinctive industrial noises. To mask them, secret printers often worked at odd hours or during the noise of street traffic. Then there was the smell. A print shop smells of stale urine used to treat the leather ink balls, oil, and damp paper. It is a distinctive, pungent odor that permeates clothes and walls. And the supplies, you can't just buy 500 reams of paper without raising eyebrows. Paper was expensive and tracked. Type was even harder to get. Type founders were strictly regulated. Carter likely had to smuggle type from the continent or buy it on the black market from sympathetic founders. Despite these dangers, Carter became a ghost. He operated under a series of false identities. On the title pages of his books, he never printed London William Carter. That would be suicide. Instead, he used the imprint Johannum Bogardi or Apud Iohann Bogardum. He listed false locations, Douai, Rouen, Mons, or Bruges. These were cities on the continent with large communities of English Catholic exiles. By claiming the books were printed abroad and smuggled in, Carter achieved two things. First, he protected himself. Second, he gave the books an aura of foreign authority. He became the primary publisher for the recusants, the Catholics who refused to attend Anglican services. He printed a new edition of The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, a book of profound spiritual comfort. He printed the works of John Fisher, the cardinal executed by Henry VIII. He printed Robert Parsons, the fiery Jesuit leader. He was running a one-man propaganda machine right under the Queen's nose. But in a city of spies, you can only stay hidden for so long. The authorities knew someone was printing these books. The paper was English. The type was worn in specific ways. The foreign books were appearing too quickly, too cheaply, and in too great a quantity to be solely imports. The Stationers' Company and the Queen's pursuivants began to circle. Carter's life became a revolving door of incarceration. In 1578, he was arrested and thrown into the Poultry Compter, a small sheriff's prison. The charge was not going to church. It was a holding charge. They suspected more but couldn't prove it. In 1579, he was moved to the Gatehouse Prison in Westminster. His wife likely had to manage the household and the hidden equipment while he was away. They kept him locked up, interrogated him, and watched his visitors. But Carter was disciplined. He didn't crack. He didn't give up the location of his press. He played the part of the stubborn recusant, not the mastermind printer. In 1581, they released him on bond, but it was a trap. He was placed under what we would call house arrest. He was forbidden to travel more than 3 miles from his home. He was watched. The government was waiting for him to make a mistake. They were waiting for him to lead them to the big fish, the Jesuits, the seminarians, the traitors. Carter returned to Tower Hill. He reunited with his wife. He saw his press silent and dusty. A prudent man would have dismantled it. A prudent man would have thrown the type into the Thames. William Carter cleaned the ink balls. He set the type. He went back to work. The year 1582 arrived. The tension in England was at a breaking point. The Jesuit mission, led by Edmund Campion, who had been executed just months before, had terrified the government. The state was taking the gloves off. And in the shadows of the royal court, The Queen's most sadistic hunter, Richard Topcliffe, received a tip. He looked at the name on the paper. William Carter, Tower Hill. Topcliffe smiled. It was time to pay a visit. The ink on the informant's note was barely dry before the machinery of the state ground into motion. For Richard Topcliffe, the name William Carter was not just a lead. It was an invitation to destroy a vital artery of the Catholic resistance. As the hunter prepared his forces and the winter fog settled over London, the days of quiet industry at Tower Hill were numbered. The shadow that had been hovering over Carter's press for years was about to solidify into a terrifying reality, shattering the domestic peace of his household and dragging him from the sanctuary of his workshop into the cold light of the Inquisitor's gaze. The winter of 1582 was bitter in London. The Thames froze in patches, and the fog that rolled off the river was thick enough to hide 1,000 sins. For William Carter, living in his house on Tower Hill, the cold was the least of his worries. He was living on borrowed time, and he knew it. Every creak of the floorboards, every shout from the street below, sent a spike of adrenaline through his chest. He was a man waiting for the hammer to fall. It fell in late December. The raid was orchestrated by the relentless priest-hunter, Richard Topcliffe. To understand the terror of this moment, you have to understand the man waiting in the shadows. Topcliffe was not just an enforcer. He was a fanatic. He was a member of the landed gentry who had dedicated his life to the hunting of Catholics. He did not just want to arrest them. He wanted to dismantle them. He was known to keep a private rack in his own home to torture prisoners when the Tower officials were too squeamish. When Topcliffe knocked, it wasn't the law calling, it was the graveyard. Topcliffe's men smashed into the house at Tower Hill. There was no time to hide the evidence. The safety measures Carter had relied on, the false walls, the hidden compartments, were useless against a raid of this ferocity. The agents tore the house apart. They ripped up floorboards. They smashed furniture. They found everything. They found the vestments used for the illegal Catholic Mass, the stoles, the chasubles, the altar cloths. They found the chalices. In the eyes of the law, these were popish trumpery, evidence of treasonous religious practices. But the real prize was the paper. They found the books. They found the stacks of unbound manuscripts, the smell of fresh ink still clinging to them, and they found the press itself. For Carter, seeing his press discovered must have been like watching his own heart being ripped out. That machine was his life's work. It was his voice. Now it was evidence. Carter was dragged from his home. He was not taken back to the gatehouse or the poultry compter. Those were prisons for debtors and nuisances. He was taken to the Tower of London. The Tower is a sprawling complex, a city within a city. It is a palace, an armory, and a zoo. But for William Carter, it was simply the end of the world. He was thrown into a dungeon. The conditions were horrific. The cells were damp, rat-infested, and freezing. But the physical deprivation was just the softening up process. The government didn't just want to punish Carter. They wanted to mine him for information. They knew he was the hub of a wheel. They wanted to know the spokes. Who was writing the books? Who was funding the paper? Where were the priests hiding? Which noble families were buying the contraband? They took him to the rack. The rack is a deceptively simple machine. It is a rectangular wooden frame raised off the ground. The prisoner is laid on top of it. Their wrists are tied to a roller at one end, and their ankles are tied to a roller at the other. The executioner inserts a lever into the ratchet mechanism and turns it. The pain is purely mechanical. It is the physics of tension applied to human biology. First, the ligaments stretch, then the joints in the shoulders and hips begin to pop out of their sockets. If the tension is increased, the muscle fibers themselves begin to tear. It creates a systemic, overwhelming trauma that pushes the human nervous system beyond the threshold of endurance, encompassing the entire body in absolute pain. Carter was racked repeatedly. We have to pause and imagine the specific horror of this for a printer. A printer's livelihood is in his hands, his dexterity, his ability to pick type, to mix ink, to turn the screw of the press. His hands were his tools. The rack was destroying the very instruments of his trade. Yet, Carter held on. He gave them nothing. He refused to name the priests. He refused to implicate the families who had sheltered him. He protected the network with a silence born of absolute conviction. But the authorities had another way to hurt him. While Carter was rotting in the tower, suffering the dislocation of his limbs, a tragedy was unfolding outside the walls that would break his heart more effectively than any machine. His wife died. The historical record surrounding her death is sparse but chilling. She died while her husband was in the tower. Some sources suggest she died of the plague or natural illness, exacerbated by the stress of the raid and the seizure of their property. But there are darker, persistent rumors that suggest a more sinister cause. It is believed by some historians that the authorities tried to use her against William. They may have pressured her, threatened her, or manipulated her in an attempt to get her to turn on her husband or give up the names he was protecting. The guilt, the fear, and the destitution, with her husband gone, the income stopped, and the house seized, may have been too much. When the news reached Carter in his cell, it must have shattered him. He was now truly alone. He had lost his freedom, his business, his physical health, and now his wife. The person he was fighting for, the person he was trying to return to, was gone. But if the government thought this despair would make him talk, they were wrong. It had the opposite effect. With his wife dead, Carter had nothing left to lose. He had no leverage they could use against him. He became a man made of iron. Realizing that torture wasn't working, the Crown decided to shift tactics. They couldn't break him, so they decided to kill him. But they had a legal problem. Printing Catholic books was illegal, yes. It was a felony. But felonies were usually punished by fines, imprisonment, or perhaps the loss of ears. It wasn't necessarily high treason. And the government wanted William Carter to die a traitor's death. They wanted the full spectacle of Tyburn to send a message to the rest of the London underground. To execute him for treason, they needed to prove that he had plotted the death of the Queen or the overthrow of the government. Printing prayer books didn't qualify. They needed a smoking gun. They ordered their lawyers to comb through every single book Carter had ever printed. They were looking for a sentence, a phrase, anything that could be twisted into a death threat. They found it in a book printed nearly 4 years earlier, in 1580. The book was titled A Treatise of Schism. It was written by Gregory Martin, a brilliant Oxford scholar living in exile. Carter had printed over 1,000 copies of it. The book was primarily a theological argument intended to stop church papists, Catholics who attended Protestant services to avoid fines, from compromising their faith. It argued that schism was a sin and that Catholics should refuse to enter Anglican churches. It was controversial, certainly. It was illegal, yes. But was it treason? The Crown lawyers focused on a single paragraph. It was a retelling of the biblical story of Judith and Holofernes. In the Old Testament book of Judith, the Jewish people are besieged by the Assyrian army, led by the brutal general Holofernes. The situation is hopeless. Judith, a pious and beautiful widow, prays to God, then walks into the enemy camp. She charms Holofernes, gains his trust, and gets him drunk. When he passes out in his tent, she takes his own sword and hacks off his head. she returns to her people with the head in a bag, saving Israel. In his book, Gregory Martin used this story as an allegory. He wrote that just as Judith destroyed Holofernes to save her people, the pious soul should destroy heresy. He exhorted Catholic women to imitate Judith's piety and courage in resisting the sin of schism. To a reasonable reader, it was a standard religious metaphor. Kill the sin, not the sinner. It was a call for spiritual warfare, not physical violence. But the Elizabethan prosecution team was not composed of reasonable readers. They were men paid to find treason. They performed a feat of interpretative gymnastics that was breathtaking in its cynicism. They constructed the following argument. Holofernes, the tyrant general, was a stand-in for Queen Elizabeth I. Judith, the assassin, was a stand-in for the English Catholic community. Therefore, by encouraging Catholics to imitate Judith, William Carter was not teaching the Bible. He was sending a coded message, inciting the ladies of the royal court to murder the queen in her bed. They argued that the book was an assassination manual disguised as theology. They claimed that by printing it, Carter was imagining and conspiring the death of the queen. Under the Treasons Act, imagining the death of the monarch was a capital crime. Armed with this twisted logic, they finally brought William Carter to trial. The date was January 10th, 1584. The location was the Old Bailey, the grim courthouse next to Newgate Prison. The trial was a formality. Carter stood in the dock, pale from his long imprisonment and likely in pain from the racking. He faced the full weight of the Crown's legal team. Carter defended himself with surprising vigor. He addressed the jury, arguing that the passage was clearly allegorical. He pointed out the obvious. The story of Judith and Holofernes was in the Bible? It was in the very Bible that the Protestants used. Was the Bible now treasonous? He argued that the author, Gregory Martin, was speaking of killing heresy, not killing queens. He explained that he was a printer, not an assassin. He printed what was given to him. He argued that if printing a metaphor was treason, then half the writers in England should be hanged. But the atmosphere in the courtroom was poisonous. The jury was not listening to the logic. They were listening to the fear. The prosecution painted a picture of a vast Catholic conspiracy, waiting for a signal to slit the throats of good Protestants in their sleep. They pointed to Carter as the man ringing the bell. The jury did not want to look soft on treason. They did not want to be accused of sympathizing with a man who hated the queen. They retired to consider the verdict. They returned almost immediately. It took them 15 minutes to decide a man's life. The foreman stood up, guilty. The judge donned the black cap. He pronounced the sentence that Carter must have known was coming from the moment Topcliffe kicked down his door. You are to be drawn on a hurdle to the place of execution, and there be hanged by the neck, and being alive cut down, and your privy members to be cut off, and your bowels to be taken out of your belly, and there burned, you being alive, and your head to be cut off, and your body to be divided into 4 quarters, and your head and quarters to be disposed of at Her Majesty's pleasure. William Carter listened to the sentence. He made no plea for mercy. He knew that the time for words was over. He had printed his last page. Now he would have to write the final chapter with his life. He was taken back to the dungeon to spend his last night on earth. He made his peace with God. He likely thought of his late wife, and he prepared himself for the ordeal of the next morning. As the long night in the dungeon gave way to the gray light of dawn, the legal formalities ended and the physical ordeal began. Carter had made his peace with God in the silence of his cell, preparing for the inevitability of death, but he remained unaware of the unique horror that awaited him. The sentence had been passed and the warrant signed, setting the stage at Tyburn for what was intended to be a routine display of royal power. But as the sheriff's men dragged him to the hurdle, no one, not the executioner, not the crowd, and certainly not Carter himself, could have predicted that the script of the execution was about to be rewritten by a catastrophic error. The morning of January 11th, 1584 dawned with the grim slate-gray sky typical of a London winter. The air was biting, damp enough to seep through the thin clothes of the prisoners in Newgate. For William Carter, this was the last sunrise. The sheriff's men came for him early. He was brought out into the courtyard of Newgate Prison. He was not alone. Typically, executions were conducted in batches to save money and maximize the spectacle, though Carter was the star attraction of the day due to the treason charge. The method of transport to Tyburn was part of the punishment. A traitor was not allowed to walk, nor were they allowed the dignity of a cart. They were to be drawn. Carter was strapped onto a hurdle. This was a crude sled, often just a section of wicker fencing or a few rough planks nailed together. It had no wheels. It was tied directly to the horse's tail or harness. Carter was laid flat on his back. His wrists were bound. He was dragged out of the prison gates and onto the cobbled streets. The journey from Newgate to Tyburn, near modern-day Marble Arch, was roughly 3 miles. It was a journey of calculated humiliation. As the horse moved, the hurdle bounced and scraped over the uneven stones. The mud of the street mixed with the filth of horses, the refuse of the markets, and the contents of chamber pots splashed over him. The crowds lined the route. An execution was the premier entertainment of the Elizabethan age. Apprentices skipped work. Merchants closed their stalls. They shouted at him. They threw rotten vegetables, stones, and mud. They jeered at the papist traitor. But amidst the noise, there were silent witnesses. In the crowd, hidden under cloaks and hats, were the Catholics Carter had served. They were there not to jeer, but to pray. To them, this was not a criminal procession. It was a Via Dolorosa. They watched the man who had printed their prayer books being dragged through the dirt, and they committed his face to memory. They arrived at Tyburn. The Tyburn tree was a permanent fixture of the London landscape. It was a massive triangular gallows formed by 3 tall posts joined at the top by 3 crossbeams. It was a machine designed for mass production. It could hang 24 men at once if necessary. The atmosphere at Tyburn was rowdy, almost like a fairground. Vendors sold pies and ale. Pickpockets worked the crowd. The executioner and his assistants waited on the scaffold, the tools of their trade laid out like surgical instruments: the rope, the knife, the axe, and the fire. Carter was untied from the hurdle. He stood up, his clothes sodden and filthy, his body aching from the racking and the rough journey. But witnesses record that his spirit was unbroken. He was ordered to climb the ladder to the cart positioned under the beam. The Sheriff of London, anxious to validate the state's action, demanded a final confession. He asked Carter to ask the Queen for forgiveness. Carter's response was simple. He turned to the crowd and said, "I desire you all to pray to God for me, and I do pray to God for the Queen." He refused to confess to treason. He refused to admit that printing a book about Judith and Holofernes was a crime. He maintained his innocence to the end. He was dying for his faith, not for a plot. He entrusted his soul to God. The executioner placed the noose around his neck. It was a thick, heavy hemp rope. The knot was positioned. The cart was driven away. William Carter fell. The rope went taut. Now we must understand the grim mechanics of the sentence. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. The hanging was not meant to kill, unlike a modern execution where the drop is calculated to snap the neck and cause instant brain death. The Tudor hanging was a strangulation. The victim was meant to dance at the end of the rope, choking, their face turning purple, their legs thrashing in panic. The executioner's job was a dark art. He had to watch the victim closely. He had to wait until the struggle began to fade, until the victim went limp from lack of oxygen, but before the heart stopped beating. The goal was to render the victim unconscious or semi-conscious, so they could be cut down alive for the next stage of the punishment. On this day, the executioner failed. Perhaps he was inexperienced. Perhaps he was distracted by the crowd. Perhaps he simply miscalculated the weight of the man. He cut the rope too soon. William Carter dropped to the ground. He hadn't been hanging long enough to pass out. He hadn't even been hanging long enough to be dazed. He hit the straw-covered scaffold with a thud. The shock of the fall, combined with the sudden rush of air back into his lungs, acted like a shot of adrenaline. William Carter rolled over. He shook his head. He looked up. He was fully, completely awake. The crowd gasped. Usually the traitor lay like a rag doll on the scaffold, groaning perhaps, but incapable of resistance. Carter tried to stand up. The guards and the executioner's assistants rushed him. They tackled him, pinning his arms and legs to the wood. The executioner, realizing his mistake, but bound by the protocol of the law, decided to proceed anyway. He grabbed his knife. He ripped open Carter's shirt. He did not pause to let the man lose consciousness. Carter was pinned to the wood, staring up at the winter sky, with the face of the butcher looming over him. The executioner made the cut. He sliced Carter's abdomen open from the sternum to the groin. The pain must have been absolute. This was vivisection. It was surgery without anesthesia, performed with a blade that was likely more like a cleaver than a scalpel. And this is where William Carter entered the history books. As the executioner plunged his hands into the open cavity of the body to locate the bowels, the ritual of drawing, Carter did not just scream inarticulately. He fought. He strained against the men holding him down. He managed to lift his head. He looked at the man who was effectively murdering him, and he spoke. According to the accounts, he shouted with terrifying clarity, "Lord, I am not dead yet." Other sources record a more direct confrontation. "Hold, I am not dead yet." It was a protest of such surreal horror that it froze the blood of the spectators. The crowd had come for a show, but this was a nightmare. They were watching a man arguing about his own death while his intestines were being handled. The executioner panicked. He had lost control of the ritual. The solemn punishment of a traitor had turned into a brawl with a dying man. He couldn't continue the intricate process of removing the organs and burning them while the victim was shouting at him. Abandoning the knife, the executioner reached for the axe. Usually the axe was reserved for the very end, to chop off the head after the victim had died from the disembowelment. But the executioner swung the axe down on the living man to sever his head. It was a brutal, clumsy blow delivered in panic. It finally silenced the printer. With the victim now dead, the executioner returned to the script. He finished removing the entrails. He threw them into the fire that was burning nearby. The smell of roasting flesh drifted over the silent, horrified crowd. He then took the heart. He held it up, dripping with blood. "Behold the heart of a traitor," he shouted. Usually the crowd would roar back, "God save the Queen." But on January 11th, 1584, the response was muted. The spectacle had backfired. The people had seen a man of courage brutalized by a state that seemed incompetent and cruel. They didn't see a traitor. They saw a man who had fought to the last breath. The final act of the sentence was the quartering. Carter's body was chopped into 4 pieces. The head was severed. The state intended to use these pieces as billboards of terror. They boiled the quarters in parboiling pans with cumin and tar to preserve them. His head was spiked on London Bridge. It joined the rotting skulls of other martyrs, a grim sentry staring blindly at the commuters crossing the river. His quarters were distributed to the gates of the city, Ludgate, Newgate, Aldgate, Bishopsgate. The message was meant to be, "This is what happens to printers who defy the Queen." But the message received by the underground was very different. That night and in the nights that followed, Catholics crept out of the shadows. They went to the gates. They couldn't take down the quarters. They were too high and too well guarded. But they gathered beneath them. They didn't see rotting meat. They saw relics. The story of the botched execution spread like wildfire through the taverns and the secret masses. The phrase, "I am not dead yet," became a rallying cry. It took on a double meaning. William Carter, the man, was dead. But William Carter, the symbol, he was not dead yet. The Catholic faith he had printed, it was not dead yet. The resistance, it was not dead yet. The government had tried to silence a printer. Instead, they had given him a microphone that would echo for centuries. The physical destruction of William Carter was absolute. His body was dismantled according to the law, boiled in tar, and displayed as a grotesque warning to the city. Yet as the spectators dispersed from Tyburn that afternoon, the atmosphere was not one of submission, but of uneasy silence. The brutality they had witnessed did not incite the intended fear. Rather, it planted a seed of quiet resentment. The government had staged a spectacle of power, but in the eyes of the silent observers, they had merely engaged in an act of butchery that stripped the state of its moral authority. When the fires at Tyburn finally burned down to embers on that January afternoon in 1584, the executioner and the sheriff likely believed the matter was closed. They had dismantled the man, they had boiled his quarters and spiked his head on London Bridge. In the brutal logic of the Tudor state, William Carter had been erased. He was now just another piece of rotting meat warning the city of the price of treason. But the government had made a critical miscalculation. They had forgotten the nature of the man's trade. William Carter was a printer. His life's work was not contained in his body. It was contained in the thousands of pages he had pressed, bound, and distributed. You can hang a man, but you cannot hang a book. You can draw and quarter a printer, but you cannot put the ink back in the barrel. In the days following the execution, a strange phenomenon occurred. Instead of frightening the Catholic underground into silence, the gruesome death of Carter, and specifically his final defiant cry of, "I am not dead yet," electrified the resistance. The book that had killed him, Gregory Martin's Treatise of Schism, instantly became the most sought-after object in the English underground. Before the trial, it was merely a theological manual. After the trial, it was a relic. It was a blood book. To own a copy was to own a piece of the martyr's legacy. The government's attempt to censor the book had inadvertently provided it with the greatest marketing campaign in history. By publicly arguing in court that the book contained a coded message to assassinate the Queen, the prosecution had piqued the curiosity of every reader in London. Protestants and Catholics alike wanted to read the infamous Judith and Holofernes paragraph. They wanted to see the words that were powerful enough to kill a man. Copies of the book were hidden in cellars, sewn into the linings of coats, and smuggled into prisons. The very ideas the Queen wanted to suppress were now circulating with a new, dangerous vitality. Carter's press was smashed, but his product was everywhere. The execution of William Carter marked a turning point in the ink war between the English state and the Catholic resistance. Until this point, the government had hoped that by decapitating the printing network, arresting the master printers like Carter, they could stop the flow of contraband literature. They were wrong. They were fighting a hydra. For every press they smashed, two more seemed to spring up in the shadows. Carter's death created a vacuum, but it was a vacuum that nature abhorred. The Jesuit mission, led by men like Robert Persons and the future martyr Henry Garnet, realized that Carter's model was the only way forward. They could not rely on foreign imports alone. The ports were too well guarded. They needed domestic presses. Inspired by Carter's sacrifice, a new generation of secret printers emerged. But they learned from his fate. They became more mobile. They stopped setting up permanent shops in London houses. Instead, they created flying presses. These were smaller, lighter machines that could be dismantled in an hour. They were moved from country manor to country manor, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks. When the priest hunters arrived at a house, the press was already gone, leaving nothing but the faint smell of ink. One of the most famous of these successors was the press operated by the Jesuit Henry Garnet and the martyr Robert Southwell, whose own story intertwines with this era. They printed Southwell's poetry and Garnet's defenses of the faith on a press that traveled through the hiding holes of the English gentry. William Carter had proved that it could be done. He had shown that a single man in a house on Tower Hill could frustrate the entire apparatus of the Elizabethan state. He was the prototype. The printers who followed him looked to his memory as a patron saint of their trade. They knew the risks. Tyburn was always waiting, but they also knew the power of the printed word. However, Carter's death also left a darker legacy in the English legal system. The trial of William Carter set a terrifying precedent for freedom of speech in the press. The legal gymnastics used to convict him, the constructive treason of interpreting an allegorical story as a literal death threat, handed the government a new weapon. It meant that authors and printers were no longer judged on what they actually wrote, but on what the government imagined they meant. If a biblical metaphor could be treason, then anything could be treason. This cast a chill over the entire publishing industry. It wasn't just Catholic printers who were afraid. Playwrights, poets, and Protestant pamphleteers realized that the ground had shifted. If you wrote a play about a corrupt king in ancient Rome, could the Queen's lawyers argue that you were actually talking about Elizabeth? If you printed a poem about a garden where the flowers were dying, could they say you were predicting the fall of the Tudor dynasty? Self-censorship became the norm. Printers began to refuse manuscripts that seemed even remotely ambiguous. The Stationers' Company, the guild that controlled printing, tightened its grip, becoming an even more effective arm of the state police. William Carter's severed head on London Bridge was not just a warning to Catholics. It was a warning to the imagination of every writer in England. It is said, "We own the metaphors. We decide what your words mean." The timing of Carter's execution was not accidental. It was January 1584. The country was sliding inexorably toward war. Across the Channel, the Spanish Empire was assembling the Armada. The Cold War was about to turn hot. The execution of Carter was part of a clearing of the decks. The government wanted to crush the internal enemy before the external enemy arrived. In the years immediately following Carter's death, the persecution intensified. The bloody question became the standard test for Catholics. If the Spanish army invades and the Pope orders you to support them, whose side would you be on? There was no right answer. If you said the Queen, you denied your faith. If you said the Pope, you confessed to treason. Men and women who had read Carter's books found themselves facing this question on the scaffold. The comfort they found in the prayer books he had printed, the reminders of the suffering of Christ, the stories of the martyrs, became their only sustenance in the final moments. Carter had provided the spiritual armor for a generation that was about to walk into the fire. He hadn't printed political tracts. He had printed works on how to die well. And in the bloody years of the late 1580s, that was the most practical knowledge a Catholic could possess. There is a final poignant mystery in the aftermath of the execution. We know what happened to Carter's body. It was butchered, boiled, and scattered. The head was on the bridge. The quarters were on the gates. But what happened to them after that? Usually, the remains of traitors were left to rot until they were picked clean by birds or fell apart from decay. But in the case of holy men, the Catholic underground often mounted daring rescue missions. At night, risking their own lives, family members or friends would climb the gates or bribe the guards to retrieve the blackened, tarred remains. They wanted to give them a Christian burial. They wanted to save the relics. There is no official record of Carter's remains being recovered, but given the reverence in which he was held and the boldness of the London Catholics, it is highly likely that someone, on a dark, fog-choked night, climbed up to a city gate and took down the quarter of the printer. Perhaps he was buried in a secret grave in a garden. Perhaps his bones were hidden in a priest hole in a country manor alongside the very books he had printed. In a way, his disappearance was fitting. He had lived in the shadows, printed in the shadows, and operated under false names. It was appropriate that his final resting place should also be a secret, known only to the faithful few. He had become, in death, exactly what he had been in life, a hidden strength, invisible to the state, but vital to the resistance. The government moved on. The Armada came and was defeated. The Queen aged and eventually died. The Tudor dynasty ended. The noise of the 16th century faded into the history books. But in the libraries of Oxford and Cambridge, in the archives of old Catholic families, the books remained. The ink that William Carter had mixed with his own hands did not fade. The paper he had pressed did not crumble. While the flesh of the executioner turned to dust, the work of the printer survived. The man who had screamed, "I am not dead yet," had spoken a literal truth. As long as his books were read, as long as his story was told, the government could not kill him. Centuries rolled over the grave of the Tudor dynasty. The racks rusted, the fires of Tyburn went cold, and the busy streets of London paved over the rivers of blood. Yet, in the quiet corners of history, in the libraries of ancient universities and the secret archives of the church, the name of William Carter refused to fade. The silence imposed by the state eventually gave way to the slow, steady judgment of history. The books he had printed in the shadows had outlasted the queens who banned them, paving the way for a final glorious vindication that would lift the humble printer from the obscurity of police records to the universal acclaim of the altars. If the objective of the Elizabethan state was to obliterate the memory of William Carter, they failed because they misunderstood the nature of his legacy. They destroyed the man and they smashed the press, but they could not destroy the product. Paper is fragile. It burns at 451 degrees Fahrenheit. It rots in damp cellars. It is eaten by worms. Yet paradoxically, paper is one of the most durable substances in human history when it carries an idea that people are willing to die for. While Carter's body was disintegrating on the gates of London, the books he had printed were embarking on their own perilous journeys. They became the most prized possessions of the English Catholic underground. Consider the physical reality of one of Carter's books surviving to the present day. A copy of a treatise of schism, the very blood book that sent him to the gallows, sits today in the archives of a research library. If you were to hold it with white gloves, you would be holding a crime scene. These books survived because they were loved. They were not treated as disposable commodities. They were wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture and hidden in priest holes, the secret compartments built into the walls and fireplaces of Catholic manor houses. Owners often tore out the title pages or burned them, removing the incriminating evidence of the printer's mark, trusting only the text itself. If you look at the margins of these surviving books, you often find handwritten notes in Latin, prayers, or the names of family members who were imprisoned. The book became a living repository of the family's suffering. Carter's books traveled to the continent, to the seminaries in Douay and Rome, where they inspired young men to return to England as priests. They traveled back into England in the pockets of those same priests. They were read by candlelight in the attics of London, while the priest hunters banged on the front door. Every surviving copy is a testament to Carter's craftsmanship and his courage. The ink he mixed in the house on Tower Hill 400 years ago is still black. The impression of the type he set is still crisp. The state could kill the printer, but they could not fade his ink. While Carter was revered as a martyr by the people who knew him, the official machinery of the Catholic Church moved with the speed of a glacier. For centuries, William Carter remained in a kind of canonical limbo. He was known as a venerable, a title of respect, but he was not a blessed or a saint. There were political reasons for this delay. For the Vatican, the English martyrs were a diplomatic minefield. To canonize men who were executed for treason was seen by the British government as a provocative act. It was, in effect, the Pope declaring that the British legal system had committed murder. During the 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries, as the British Empire rose to global dominance, the Vatican was cautious. They did not want to antagonize the British crown. The files on the martyrs gathered dust in the archives of the Congregation for Rights, but the memory was kept alive by the orders. The Jesuits, the Benedictines, and the secular clergy kept lists. They kept the martyrologies, the daily records of who died, where, and how. William Carter's name was on those lists. He was the layman among the priests, the worker among the scholars. It was not until the 20th century, when the British Empire had faded and the sectarian wounds had begun to heal, that the cause was reopened. Historians began to comb through the Elizabethan state papers. They found the records of Topcliffe's raids. They found the transcripts of the show trial at the Old Bailey. They found the undeniable proof that Carter had died not for a political plot but for his conscience. The waiting ended in 1987. 85 martyrs of England and Wales were selected for beatification. This is the final step before sainthood. The ceremony did not take place in a quiet chapel. It was not a private affair. On November 22, 1987, Pope John Paul II, a man who himself had lived under the tyranny of Nazis and communists, and who understood the power of the underground press, declared William Carter blessed. The printer from Tower Hill was raised to the glory of the altars. It was a vindication that took 403 years. The man who had been dragged through the mud of London, whose head had been spiked on a bridge to rot, was now invoked in the liturgy of the Universal Church. The Pope spoke of these martyrs not as traitors, but as witnesses to the dignity of the human conscience. He framed their resistance not as a political rebellion, but as a spiritual refusal to let the state own the soul. For the descendants of the English Catholic families, the families who had hidden Carter's books in their walls for 4 centuries, it was a moment of profound emotion. The printer of shadows was finally standing in the light. If you go to London today, you can visit the site of William Carter's death, but you will not find a quiet cemetery. Tyburn is now known as Marble Arch. It is one of the busiest, noisiest intersections in London. It is a chaotic swirl of red double-decker buses, black taxis, and tourists shopping on Oxford Street. The river Tyburn, which once flowed past the gallows, is now buried underground, a lost river flowing through a concrete culvert beneath the pavement. But if you know where to look, the memory is there. In the middle of a traffic island surrounded by the roar of engines, There's a simple stone plaque set into the ground. It marks the site of the Tyburn tree, and just a short walk away is the Tyburn convent. Here in a quiet chapel, an order of nuns maintains a perpetual vigil. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a nun is kneeling in prayer. They are praying for the souls of the 105 Catholic martyrs who died at that spot. In the crypt of the convent, there are relics, bones, pieces of cloth, fragments of rope salvaged by the faithful in the 16th century. It is a place of silence in the center of the noise. It is the spiritual successor to the silence William Carter kept on the rack. Why does William Carter matter today? We are not Elizabethan Catholics. We do not live in a world of racks and quartering blocks, but we do live in a world of information warfare. William Carter is, in a very real sense, a patron saint for the freedom of the press and for the digital underground. He was the 16th century equivalent of a dissident blogger or a provider of encrypted communication. He used technology, the press, to bypass state censorship. He used encryption, false names, false locations, to protect his sources. He built a network of distribution that relied on trust and shared values. He reminds us that the battle for truth is always a battle for the means of production. The state didn't care about Carter's private thoughts. They cared about his ability to publish them. They killed him because he controlled a platform. His story asks us a difficult question. What is the price of a sentence? For us, typing a sentence is free. We hit publish and it goes to the world. For William Carter, typing a sentence required lead, oil, sweat, and fear. And ultimately, it required his blood. He proves that the pen is mightier than the sword is not just a cliche, it is a historical fact. The swords of the Elizabethan executioners have all rusted away. The axes are in museums, but the books William Carter printed, they are still being read. The logic of the executioner is that you can kill an idea by killing the man who speaks it. The logic of the printer is that if you put an idea on paper, it becomes immortal. On that cold January morning when the executioner's axe smashed into his skull, the state thought they had the final word. They were wrong. The final word belongs to the man who looked up from the butcher's block, his body ruined but his spirit untouched, and shouted the truth that echoes down the centuries. To every tyrant who tries to silence the truth, I am not dead yet.